Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. And hello, as usual, to everyone watching us on YouTube afterwards. So today we're not starting soon. In fact, we are wait for it live.
Live.
Not as slick as usual there. So please do be aware that a number of us have had problems with connectivity this evening. We're hoping that we have got rid of those gremlins and we're going to be fine from here on in. Fingers crossed. Today, all five of the Rooks are here. Mark's here, Andy Law's here, Graham's here, Andy Leask is here, and of course, I, your host, are here this evening. So today we have got some questions from the last Ask Us Anything that we did that were left over that we promised we would do in a few weeks' time. And we've also got a few more questions that I have added and we'll bring up as we go through. But please, as always, if you have any comments or questions, please comment on the stream and I will bring them up onto the screen like this. Ask your questions as we go through the stream tonight.
Well, here's a question to start with. Where's Seagoat? He's late.
Oh, Seagoat sends his apologies for this evening. I think... I don't know if Seagoat is a he. They send their apologies as they are at a wedding this evening.
Oh, okay. Just so used to seeing him first in the comments.
That means Righty was first this week then.
Exactly.
All right, so what's up first?
Right, what is up first? Let us have a look. Let us start with... What have you found most challenging starting your own project rather than working on someone else's? I feel like we might have answered this one. Did we answer this one last time?
We definitely answered something similar last time. Nevertheless, we can answer it again in a slightly different fashion, I'm sure. My one is I'm going to refer to something that Graham has brought up on more than one occasion, and that is limitations. When you're starting off with something that's your own and the horizon is quite literally the limit, you start obviously with all these amazing ideas, and we're all super creative people with super creative ideas that we can throw at the screen and at each other. However, turning those into something that is neat, defined, and can then be packaged up and producted up for everybody is a process. And then once we reach that point and we've decided what that's going to be, turning that into a set of key processes afterwards to ensure that we can churn it out at a relatively quick rate is, for me, the largest part of the challenging side of it. We've gone through our blue sky area. We now have a pretty dang strong idea of what we're doing. We have very clear goals as to what all the products are going to be. Now it's just a matter of making them. That's my biggest challenge, I'd say.
I'm sorry.
So no, Mark, please go.
No, I forgot what I was going to say. Go on, Lindsay.
Oh no, I've done it now.
Yeah, remembering what I want to do is a big challenge for me.
Yeah, I think the greatest thing about working for ourselves is no limitations imposed from outside, and the most challenging thing is also no limitations imposed from outside, because we're also creative and we have all these ideas. It's so hard to know when to rein ourselves in and make a limit. Because
just draw a line under something. Be like, that's it, done.
And it's just establishing a framework, for our products and at least a vague set of boundaries. Which direction do we want to push things in? Where do we want to hold back? And getting a consensus on that it's part of the fun, that back and forth,
Yeah.
But it is challenging sometimes.
Yeah,
and one of the worst sort of things of that, though, is often the stuff we come up with later in the process is often really, really good. So it was good that we delayed, but nonetheless frustrating because then we need to go back and change things. And it's a constant tension, isn't it?
And at some point we just have to call it done, and that's maybe the hardest thing of all.
On that note,
Graham and I have done quite a few things together at various points in our careers, and I think we've had maybe 4 times where we've gone, we just need to draw a line under this. It's right. Time to ship.
On that note, When will Ship of Fools be ready to be released? Give us a progress update, Andy Law.
Progress update. Okay, that one's relatively easy. The editing has been actually passed around between us, almost as a shared job rather than just sitting on a single editor. Andy did the first really heavy edits and is the editor, but he just dropped into exam period time. So Graham and I picked up the heavy load when he dropped into his exams, and we've just pretty much finished it. It's done.
Yeah.
The next stage is layout and art, both of which are pretty prolonged definitely for our first products, because we're going to have a lot of discussion as to how we want things to look. It's an inevitable part of the process, because this is going to nail us down for pretty much most of the Coil Crown products as we move forward. So where other books will take much less time to put into place because we'll have all those templates in place, the first one is going to take longer. So the absolutely accurate answer to this is when it's done. And I think we've said this before, and indeed, I think this question's also been asked last time as well. So possibly you're getting some duplication here.
No, that question has been asked again.
Well,
So
yeah.
I'm fully aware that we've answered that before, but that has now been asked
I have
again.
a feeling we'll be seeing that question every time we do a Q&A.
Yeah.
It's an inevitability, isn't it? Having said that, though, the final text is, for those of you who were part of the playtest, both the same as it was before and also really quite different. I cannot express enough how thankful I am for everyone that came in and offered us their ideas. Some of those ideas have been installed pretty much neat because they were just so brilliant. Other ideas have been taken further. For those of you who have an expectation for how certain things are going to pan out, you're going to probably find a few of those situations have changed significantly.
And Righty Stream Stuff says about the previous question, at least no one's going to cut stuff when your back's turned. Walton says that question, when will Ship of Fools be ready, is going to keep on being asked until we get the answer we want.
Or until you get the product in your hands, if my experience is any guide.
Okay, let us have, here's a more, a bigger question, maybe. Long Shadow, this is from last time. Which tabletop role-playing games have had, wait for it, a mass effect on you?
Topical for the time. Anyone want to jump on that one?
I'm going to shout out a perhaps not as well known, at least nowadays, RPG. I'm a huge fan, or was a huge fan back in the day, of the Conspiracy X role-playing game, which obviously was like a spin on kind of the X-Files style thing with kind of various alien invasions happening secretly. But it was more of a you were fighting against them as part of your own sort of conspiracy. You almost were more like the cigarette smoking man rather than Mulder and Scully. But what I really liked about it had some really unusual mechanics that I haven't seen replicated in lots of other tabletop role-playing games as much. It had a really strong like pulling strings mechanic for you kind of exerting influence, because everybody who was in the conspiracy all belonged to some other organization. So you might be a member of the Navy, say, so you could pull strings within the Navy, or you might be a reporter, so you have like media connections. And it had mechanics for that in a way that's, I mean, I'm not saying they're not out there in other games, but certainly I hadn't encountered them in other games before. And I also liked their resolution system. I thought was quite interesting because it scaled very steeply. So if you had somebody who was like really, really good at something and somebody who was a total novice, like say an expert martial artist and a total novice fighter, you didn't even roll dice to resolve that combat. The expert just won automatically, which I quite liked. There was only a scale of about maybe 5 in terms of skills as well, so it wasn't too hard to get some parity. And my favorite mechanic within it of all was it had psychics. And the way they tested psychic powers, instead of using dice like in every other test, it used Xener cards, thus meaning if you were actually psychic, you had a benefit when playing a psychic, which I just thought was a lovely little twist within it.
Couple of wavy lines.
Yeah, and I think what I loved about it was, we've spoken about this before, but the idea of the system sort of supporting the background, and I really felt it did that in a really, really thorough way, in a way that I found, certainly at the time when I was first sort of encountered it, really, really exciting. So that's probably the one that's had the biggest impact on me. So.
I have two. Mine are both very obvious, but I think it would be a lie for me to say anything else. The first one's Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Thanks, Graham.
It wasn't just me.
I know, but nevertheless, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Thanks, Graham. Warhammer, for me, and I'm going to take a slightly different angle than I'd normally take. Warhammer for me was great because it did something that most other fantasy role plays didn't do, and it inspired me specifically in the material I created later, and not just for Warhammer. And what that did was it said, hey, you know all those things that you can use that. Warhammer was always a game that was based upon all the miniatures they happened to have hanging around. And the original Warhammer, as it came about, was just this bizarre melange of every single thing that you'd ever seen ever, thrust together into a single setting. And the initial battle game and the role-playing game was very much and we have everything. I mean, it's there.
You're right.
And away you go, and you use that the way you want. Now, in time, Warhammer became its own thing. Warhammer very much made its own version of orcs. Very, very different to the standard orc that was out there. It made its own version of the Empire in comparison to the Holy Roman Empire, which became so very, very different. But to begin with, it was something that was so very accessible. No matter what you knew about fantasy or history, there was probably a good bit of it in there for you. And it was also something that inspired the writing throughout. You found that the writing in Warhammer was just full of historical tweaks and details, but often dialed up to 11. And that's something that has inspired me throughout my writing. So number one, Warhammer, and the second one, Vampire. And again, thanks, Graham, because he was involved with this too. Vampire, again, for a slightly different reason, but one that's connected, and that is that the real world makes an extraordinarily good playground. And the Warhammer world is, in some respects, some bizarre, fancy mixture real world analogy. And Vampire was something similar. Now, Vampire, for 1,000 other reasons, has inspired me in a whole variety of different ways. But I'm just keep you on theme here so that I don't ramble on for hours. But yes, Vampire, Warhammer. They're my big Mass Effect influences, I suppose.
All right. Well, I also have two. I mean, the obvious one is Call of Cthulhu, because that brought role-playing out of the dungeon and introduced investigation and story and intelligent play. You know, you don't go, it's a Shoggoth, I hit it with my sword. not more than once, anyway, being dead shortly after the first occasion. And the other, a little more obscure, is Bushido, one of the plethora of Japanese set games that came out in the 80s, and that was the one that my college group picked up. And that was where the penny dropped that worlds didn't have to be generic, that you were working within a culture with mores and history and stuff like that. And that fueled both my penchant for historical role-playing supplements, of which I've written a couple, and it also informed Warhammer fantasy role-play to some extent, in that, you know, there is a culture and norms and mores and what have you. So those are my two.
Mine are the same as Andy's, funnily enough. Warhammer and Vampire, but probably for me, actually, I broaden it out to the World of Darkness setting, because well, if it wasn't for Vampire, I don't think me and the two Andys would have met. So obviously True. I owe a great deal to Graham writing helping to write Vampire. But for me, I love that those systems are similar, you know, so that you can take somebody in who's new to role playing and be like, well, actually, I met my best friend in the halls of my school when I walked up to her and said, do you want to come out at the weekend and pretend to be a vampire with me? But if she had more of a antagonistic feel, I could have said a werewolf. Or if she'd been kind of esoteric, I could have said a mage. So what I loved about the World of Darkness was you had this underlying system, but then you could really, whatever you fancy doing, do I want to be an eco warrior? Yeah, I think I do. I'll play werewolf. And so I just think that, as Andy says, the real world setting was so rich and so it was the early days of the internet when we started playing that. Like, the world had opened up for us to research and look at maps online, but it was also crossed over with I was at uni, so I was going to Edinburgh University Library and like getting these massive ancient folios. I was studying psychology. I don't know why I was getting on some watch list somewhere.
Yeah, same with me, university libraries, and I have to say that the crew at White Wolf did a fantastic job of not only taking the classic horror tropes and what have you, but they somehow kept, Mark Reinhagen in particular, somehow just captured the zeitgeist there. It was a archetypal late 80s, early 90s take on vampires and on everything else. All the themes and everything like that were just so spot on.
Like you could feel that, because obviously at that point, like Anne Rice was kind of exploding, and you could feel that there was a similarity there, but at no point did it feel like explicitly derivative. I mean, you could make it derivative very easily, but he obviously like took inspiration perhaps from that, but really did something different with it.
I have a story there.
A story.
Sorry, Graham.
A story.
Yeah.
Story time with Uncle Graham.
Well, when the Underworld movies first came out, I don't know if you know this, but White Wolf tried to sue Sony, and I got subpoenaed in that case.
Did you get subpoenaed?
I got subpoenaed and had to come up with a list of all the sources I had used as reference in my writing of Vampire. Wow. But then I think it was Steve Jackson Games. I think it was anyway, one of their cartoons in Pyramid magazine commented on this and had, Mark Reinhagen confronting someone from Sony, and then behind him was Anne Rice tapping him on his shoulder, and behind her was Bram Stoker tapping her on her shoulder, and it just summed it up beautifully.
Accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
There's a few comments in the chat. Warhammer and Vampire mean a lot to me. Plus, now having written for both, I don't know who Darker Days Radio is. Perhaps they can uncloak themselves.
I do. We've met. Hi.
Game that had the most influence for me, besides Wifrup, it's like that's just a given. Wifrup's obviously given was Cyberpunk 2020, especially the GM book. Listen up, you primitive screwheads. Actually, I did love Cyberpunk. That was one of my early adolescent gaming experience that I mentioned before. We always started in the Black Rose Tavern. So derivative. I would also put on my list Star Wars, because the GM chapter was really helpful. And just before we go on to the next question, which does segue nicely from that comment, Wifrup has a lot of influence on me. And the last ones having an influence is Spire, The City Must Fall, Mutant Year Zero, and Ironsworn.
I've only got one of those. I'm going to pick up the other two just so I can read them. Because why not?
They have, and Chris Handley wrote on Wrath and Glory Revised and Hellride for Halt.
Hi.
There we go. So the next question, I did say it segued nicely, and now I have completely forgotten what both the segue was and here it is. Do you think you will be able to write a general guide for GMs?
Able to? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Will we? That's a question.
It is.
It's we're currently focusing deeply on setting, on the campaign and all the trappings that you have around that campaign, which isn't specifically aimed at one game or how to present that game. Could we do a general guide for GMs? Yes, but there's a lot of good ones out there already. So we would be retreading boards that have been walked by many great minds that have come before us. I'd say that personally, it's not been discussed behind the scenes. We might go behind the scenes and go, actually, we'll do something else. But I'd say that's something that we'd really want to look at as an idea when we were presenting our own systems and presenting our own games, because then we'd be talking specifically to what we're creating rather than talking in general to everybody else. But that might not be the case. Everyone might disagree with that one.
I mean, I think we had discussed perhaps that being something that we might talk about in a podcast or on a blog or something. Potentially, but
we've also got a stream coming up that Andy and I are going to do that we were going to do last week, but Andy wasn't very well, on the tips for GM. So a more GM centered look on urban settings. So if Andy speaks mints in that, then we'll know I'm not going to write that to
totally.
you.
On that, actually, if you're watching just now, if you could mention what day during the next week would suit best, whichever day pops up most, we'll just do it on that day, assuming that Lindsay's free on that day.
Yeah.
Get that out of the way. I agreed completely.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Robin's Laws of Good Game Mastering is a must-buy.
It
If
is,
we
yeah.
had another child, I was thinking that we could call them Robin Law or Dane Law. That's my other option.
Not Marshall.
I'm not a big fan of Marshall. Maybe Ellie for a girl.
Ellie Law.
Ellie Law. Yeah.
Jalib says, I feel what's left in the queue from the last Q&A is like 4 of my questions from Discord. Well, funnily enough, here's a question from Jalib. Jalib, is there ever any consideration, Jalib, is there ever any consideration to how different Magic can be between systems, both in terms of combat utility and mobility, and how it could trivialize or bypass complex scenario elements? So I think this was a follow-on question from a system agnostic and the challenges that Magic would present, hence the consideration to how different it would be.
Yeah, this is a bummer.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
nightmare.
Thing here. Yeah, it's something that if you're writing to a specific game, it's really easy because you know exactly what the limitations of that game is. If you're writing to general, they might be able to do anything. You do need to think because certain situations you can't say, and the PCs are now in this position and can only do this. Nah, no, never. So what we have broadly done is just present the situations and we cover all the obvious methods of dealing with it. And when it comes to actual choices that are choices, they're real choices. It's the PC's making choices rather than choices foisted upon them because of the setting or anything similar. And even then, this is a game. Oh, Lindsay's disappeared. We're going to have difficulties pulling up the questions now, aren't we? So even then, I've lost my line thread there. We're very careful. Oh, here she comes again.
She's back.
You popped in, you popped out. I'm going to stop there because I've completely lost where I was.
Yeah. I think just to pick up and amplify a couple of the points Andy just made, what we do is present the broad narrative and the rules, although we provide things as a guide for you to convert to your system. The rules are largely up to you. They're your responsibility as the GM when you transfer it to your system. So we kind of conveniently wash our hands a little bit, and that includes the ins and outs of the Magic system.
Yeah, absolutely.
We don't, as much as we love new players and everything, we don't expect Rookery products to be anybody's first role-playing experience as a GM. So you know what you're doing. Go to it.
And you also know what your players can do.
Yeah.
And we're pretty expansive with how we deal with each situation. So I think we've got a pretty sweet middle ground.
Yeah. And it's definitely, for all, as is often the case with these things, like everything that's a challenge also is then an opportunity for creativity. And I know, without giving away any sort of specific spoilers, but at a sort of significant end point of one of our future kind of adventure products, the sort of transition to the next one, we have a very definite sense of where the players need to kind of end up. And we have our obvious route for how they're going to get there. But then we have to kind of account, like talking quite directly to the GMs about the myriad possible ways that the PCs may escape the net that we have set up to snare them, but the ways in which they can still end up with them being where they need to be for the next section. Right. And it is a challenge, but it is also quite fun creatively. So
agreed completely. Yeah. I mean, that is part of the joy of putting something like this together. It's not just that we get to tell awesome stories and then empower you to tell your own versions of those awesome stories.
Right.
It's that we get to tackle with the infinite possibility of player choice that sits before us. One of the best and strongest strengths that role-playing games have over, say, for example, their computer game varieties, where it's often quite binary, even when it pretends it's not. It's often you're doing one or you're doing the other. And the stories are very carefully crafted and honed often, where with a role-playing game, we can't do that. So we're not really trying. We'd much rather empower GMs to tell their own stories and give them lots of extraordinarily cool ideas to do that.
I'm sorry I had to leave. You can't tell because I have this beautiful blue screen behind me, but there is an ongoing cat crisis in the background. No need for alarm. I'm going to send for a production assistant intern to sort this issue out any moment. What else have we got here? So, it's another one. And it is related. So planning the difficulty of an encounter can be complicated even within a single system. With system agnostic design, how do you go about the GM?
Easy.
Set the challenge. I can't quite parse that. Set the challenge at an appropriate level.
This one's really
helping the GM set the challenge.
In fact, we have a massive advantage here. A massive advantage. In your average D&D adventure, Warhammer adventure, Call of Cthulhu adventure, anything similar, they've got to write it to any form of party and then provide stats. The stats that they provide must be a challenge to both powerful and weak players. It must be a challenge if they're entering combat or not. And sometimes that just breaks. The stats are too weak, so the party just steamrollers over it, or the stats are too strong and it just turns into a total party kill. Published adventures that are set for a specific game often have this interesting fakery going on where things just slowly shelve up like a computer game, and they get slowly but surely more powerful as the campaign goes on because they are aware behind the scenes that the players are doing exactly the same thing. Now, sometimes some games specifically don't do that, and they present you with a very difficult target and say use your intelligence to get around it. And there's all variety of different ways of doing that when you're building your scenarios. But generally speaking, when you're writing to a specific set of stats, you're bound by them. We're not. We can just say, this is a hard situation, stat it yourself to be hard.
Yeah.
This is an easy situation, stat it yourself to be easy. You can then write an adventure for any party, even if they're just a bunch of bakers who've never fought anything in their life. If it says an easy combat, they're going against somebody who's, if anything, even worse than them. Or on the other side, if it's a bunch of hardened mercenaries, if they're going up against a tough combat, you can very quickly say, well, if it's a tough combat, time to roll out the big guns and lay them something that is a challenge for that party. So in this case, planning a difficulty of an encounter can be complicated with a single system. Yes. With system agnostic design, how do you go about doing it? We leave it to the GMs.
Right. Yeah, back to that same theme. You know, you're a grown-up GM. You know what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. But we do have you suggested areas for statistics and similar, but they are generally broad and purposely so.
Yeah.
Great. So Roderick has got like a ton of questions, 7 in 1. Given the work you've done so far and giving yourself some limits, and the fact we know the backbone of the work in the near future is the coiled crown, what's the scope of where the Rookery is going longer term? By current guesses, fantasy in the city, a rule set, a sci-fi port of that rule set, multiple different rule sets for different purposes, different settings, acquiring IPs to deliver? Roderick, you know what the answer is going to be.
I'm just writing this down.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, but in seriousness, like we're a young company, so we've started with what we've started with, and actually a lot of what we move on to will depend on you and how the work's received. So, you know, acquiring IPs to deliver takes money. So if there's particular IPs you would have an interest in the Rookery publications delivering in future, once our stuff goes live, come and buy all our stuff and the world will be our oyster.
Yeah, totally. Spread the word.
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed. Have I got any specific ones in this one? Yes. Rule set, we've discussed this before. There is one being built in the background, but it's not our primary focus. Fantasy, yes. City, yes. Both sci-fi port of that rule set. To a degree, of depending upon how the rule set works, sure, yes. Multiple different rule sets, different purposes. Now we're reaching the point where you look at what we're doing as a general aim, which is to provide building blocks for you to use in a fashion that you want to at your own table. So rather than multiple different rule sets, it'd be far more likely to be a rule set with multiple extras added on top.
Yeah,
Right.
Modular.
A modular approach rather than the other way around, which would be let's streamline the engine for each individual thing. Different settings, sure. Acquiring IPs to deliver, that's down the line. Yeah.
So the follow-up question is: so you're not against other people's IPs? I mean,
Yeah.
no.
I mean,
we also love the freedom that we have. I think, Mark, you would very much.
I'm kind of against it.
Well,
but I'm not.
I've spent decades working on other people's intellectual property, and I would rather not do that anymore. Now, that's not to say that we might not, as a studio, we might not be involved at some point in other people's IP. But personally, I would rather not do that. But who knows?
Yeah.
It's certainly not high up on our list, is it?
No.
Things that we want to do or priorities in the immediate future.
Yeah, I agreed completely. I'm with Mark. I've done that particular rodeo, and I've been kicked off the horse once or twice, and it's just not an enjoyable.
Kicked off. Yeah.
And I've dusted myself down. I've got back up, and I've climbed back up on that horse, and then I just sat there and looked at it and went, but I think I actually prefer going on a roller coaster. To being on this particular rodeo. So let's go do a roller coaster for a while instead. Now that doesn't, as Mark says, that doesn't mean that should a perfect opportunity arise and we're all happy doing it. But I think that would be the important thing. We're all happy doing it and we all agree as a group.
Absolutely.
Because it's not about any one individual here. It's about what we all want to do. We're very collegiate in that respect. And if Mark goes, nah, I'll say nah and reply almost immediately, because that's exactly how it should be. We're working on stuff that we love.
Yeah. That's the whole point. If everybody's not having a good time making this stuff, then something's wrong and needs to be addressed. And we've all had that experience, or at least Mark and Andy and I have, of just it can feel like a grind sometimes working within someone else's limitations.
Mm-hmm.
It can also be deeply fun. Because you're telling stories with the awesome stuff that you are inspired by, or you particularly love, and that's brilliant. But I mean, I'm not going to in any way degrade it. In fact, I particularly enjoy playing within the IPs that I love. Nevertheless, it's nice not to have somebody sitting on your shoulder saying nope.
Exactly, that's it. Exactly.
Totally.
There's a follow-up question. What about acquiring RPG IPs if they're popular but otherwise not actively being developed?
See previous answer. We all have to be excited about it.
Yeah.
I mean, that feels like a reference to something that I'm missing, like a very specific example, but I don't know. Maybe I'm overreading that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, I think certainly if the opportunity came along to work on an IP that is fresh, that hasn't been tackled before, might be fun. But anything that has sort of massive expectations or baggage associated with it, I would personally want to steer clear.
I'll give a clean example of that. Actually, I personally would adore to make a Mass Effect game. He said doing that. I just would. It would be for me one of the things that I would get super excited by. I'd never want to do it though, and with our company. If the opportunity came up, I would probably say no. Why? Because I'd have EA sitting over my shoulder all the time. I'd have to get approvals, and approvals from computer game companies are super slow.
And especially AAA studios.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, having to deal with BioWare would be a slow process and potentially a frustrating one if, for example, they decided that they didn't want it to continue for one reason or another, and you'd just be left wringing your hands, going, "Why did I do this in the first place?" But nevertheless, I'm super excited by the IP. I would love to do it, but I'm probably past that now personally. Nevertheless, if they offered, it would be hard to say no.
For me, everything would depend upon the parameters of the deal. I would, for my own self, would require a great deal of creative freedom to expand and adapt the IP and to follow the rabbit holes that appeal to me, rather than just being another laborer in the word mines churning out content for a Leviathan.
So,
I think
sorry, Mark.
Sorry, it's clear. Certainly, an awful lot of the smaller tabletop studios jump on licenses because it's a great way to raise your profile. It's so many of the studios that maybe started off making their own IP have gone, oh, actually, we can get the license for this. Yeah. We know it's going to generate interest. We know it's going to generate some business and money for our studio as a whole. Plus, this will get a lot of attention. So I absolutely understand the reason for doing it. But it seems to be kind of you want to do a little bit of both. Create your own product alongside something that will generate interest. So, yeah, I'm kind of a solid maybe picking up a license would be cool.
Yeah. So writing for Cyber Magazine, working with computer game publicity people is so slow. On that note, check out Graham's article in Phoenix Magazine.
Again.
Oh, well done.
Oh dear.
Would you consider? Would you consider a multi-genre campaign in the future? Jumping from fantasy to modern day to sci-fi, for example.
I have an entire story. Would I? Yes. Are we doing that? We'll decide in the future when we get to whatever we do next. But yeah, I could tell a pretty damn good story in that particular environment, and I would have a bajillion things I could drop on it. I'm not a fan of genre specifically, but that's because a lot of the books that I read when I was growing up were both deeply pulpy but also genre busting. Take for example Michael Moorcock, which I've mentioned before. He would dance between fantasy, science fiction, something that lay somewhere in between, and then his characters would be moving through historical settings to deep future weirdness to hide drugs from the 60s to who knows where it was going to go next. And they were not often and mental and
Is that you, Andy?
Yep, that was Andy.
Yep, that was Andy's mic.
Yep.
died.
Oh,
your mic has died.
Okay, wait a minute. Am I back?
You're back.
Okay.
You're back.
That was my fault. I hit my leg against my tower. I apologize.
Ah.
So yeah, to sum up on that point, I like not being bound by genre. But I also like, particularly when we're starting off, being bound by it because it makes it much easier to build something within a very small framework, and it ensures that you've got something put in place. So would I consider it? Yes. Would I do it? That's a completely different question, and that's one that we'd all have to answer as a group.
Yeah.
Have we done it in the past in our own campaigns? Oh yes. Was it good fun? Very much so. Yeah.
And one of the things I took away from the Ship of Fools playtest was that whatever we provide, people can and do and will take it across into other genres. As we've said on previous streams, there's been Spaceship of Fools, there's been Bus of Fools, there's been Landship of Fools, there's been all sorts, more than we could ever think
but no TARDIS of Fools, not yet.
TARDIS of Fools.
Oh,
Has there been a train of fools? Has someone done like the full-on either Snowpiercer or Murder on the Orient Express?
Yeah. When they talked about someone was doing a Call of Cthulhu game with it, I immediately flashed to the Orient Express, but it turned out not to be that.
No, I'm sure someone did a train in the playtest because I'm sure that someone got thrown off the train, but
into a snowbank
on a bridge.
Yes,
on a bridge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, spoiler.
No spoiler.
That's right. Just the image of these little feet sticking out of the snowbank. Yeah.
And let me just call out and say, Book of the New Sun. Loved the Book of the New Sun. That was one of my favorite books when I was growing up. So I'm with you.
Here's another one. Assuming RPGs are evil and D&D leads to demon worshipper, a bold assumption, what do Rookery Publications products lead to? Happiness.
High blood pressure? Is that just me?
Yeah.
Just me? Okay.
Yeah, it's blurred vision, dizziness, nausea.
Late nights, breweriness. I'll get this edited. It's fine. That's a brilliant question, but I don't have a brilliant answer, and I feel like I should come up with some sort of pithy, amusing response.
Right. Yeah. Something like rejection of reality, dissociation, just choosing to live in our world. But that's
very cankers.
Oh dear. Yes.
Life in a leaky garret.
Yes. Quite possibly.
Being poor for a fair while. But yeah, it's a hard one to say. I'll try to give some sort of loose answer. This one's a hard one because we are trying to create products that, whilst they have a very clear, strong undertone, and as the products progress, that tone's going to go in a particular direction more and more heavily as it progresses. We are simultaneously ensuring that we are taking that modular approach and allowing your voice to be a consistent part of that too. Meaning that what do the products lead to? What you want.
Yeah.
In your games.
Yeah, our broad hope is that Rookery products will lead to better, more imaginative, more enjoyable campaigns, stimulation of ideas, and more fun.
Dark, horrible fun, but yeah, sure, fun.
There's another kind.
Quite.
Joining the militant wing of the BTO. Here's a more systemic. Are you going to have something like the terror track of Arkham Horror to represent the citizens of the city, recognizing the players as criminal swine?
What feels that is getting a little bit presumptive.
Or it's someone who knows their players very well.
It was probably JP.
Probably, because his players are all killers. Murder bots and murder hobos. Yes, loosely. I don't want to say yes and, because that's still part of the ongoing discussion. And because the first products, the ones that we're actually polishing right now, are not in the city dealing with these matters, these are still, let's call them terror tracks and similar, that are in a state of flux. Nevertheless, there are going to be more than just terror tracks sitting there. There's going to be a variety of tools that the GM will have at their disposal to not just deal with the criminal swine that they are, but the development of certain NPCs to make it a little bit more easy for you to track, the development of the city as a whole, the development of parts of the city, all manner of stuff, because it's going to have significant impact to the story that you'll hopefully be telling.
And relationships with both NPCs and factions of NPCs as well.
Absolutely. Right. So the answer is yes, but we have to be careful because none of this stuff can overwhelm or be difficult to track or be difficult to keep on top of. It all has to be super simple while simultaneously powerful. And that sounds as hard as it actually is. Because it has to do both. We can't do a computer game model where you can just make it as complex as you want with the mathematics behind the scenes. And then the player arrives and the NPC acts in a particular way because X equals 52,000 because of all the actions that have happened in the past. That's very easy to track on a computer game. Much harder for an RPG, particularly because you don't want to be adding to the load of the GM. What you want to be doing is inspiring the GM and making them want to do certain things so that when you're presenting this stuff, you go, yeah, I want to track that because that's awesome. So, and you want to have an easy tool to do that doesn't involve you actually doing work.
Yeah, that.
You could have a really basic character sheet for the city with stats for your relationship with each faction.
Interesting.
And that is the shortest answer in the history of Andy Law.
True. They're quite specifically Wifrip ones, I think. This one doesn't mention it, but I think it came up on the Wifrip question and answer. Hang on, Roderick says, does he get a prize for eliciting the shortest answer? No.
No.
You get a golf
Here's an
bag.
interesting one
Yes.
that we'll all, I guess we'll all, if you were still involved in WIFR, how would the following species reproduce, including family units and gender politics?
Oh no.
Yeah, no.
No, we've got-
Reverse.
No.
Reverse.
Wow,
No. Sorry.
Yeah.
that's a fun one.
This is the
Yes.
same one. How long and how different are elven childhood and adolescence compared to that of, say, a human peasant? Yeah, they're different.
That depends on the game.
Yeah,
I'm going to
exactly.
give an answer to that that's not an answer to that, and say that this is something that comes up in not just Warhammer, but most fantasy games frequently. And it comes up because people want answers, or alternatively, they have answers. And as producers that are not speaking to a specific setting, our answers have to be suggestions and ideas that inspire. That make you go, oh, that's a really funky, cool thing. But equally, we have to accept, particularly even if we're writing for something like Warhammer, that people already have their own views about how these things work. If I came in and I was writing a particular thing and said, this is how X works, all elves are this, it's going to cause problems for a lot of GMs where that's not elves, and it immediately turns people off from those products. So you have to be super careful how these things are presented. So how long and how different they are, they're exactly as long and as different as it required for your game and the type of presentation that you have for these things. Because my version, just to use Warhammer as an example, of Warhammer is different to Games Workshop's. This is well known. That's fine. Now, when I'm writing for Games Workshop, I present their one, and often a lot of these subjects aren't covered precisely because Games Workshop don't want them covered. And the same is the case when you're writing for other people's IPs. There are certain things they don't want to discuss because they haven't figured it out. And if you pin it down, they are then a slave to that for their future products, which is something that they don't necessarily want to do because they're going to open themselves up to future criticism when they contradict it.
Yeah.
There we go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, even 40k feels different depending on the novel series or even wargame.
Absolutely. And 40k is a perfect example of that. I've done quite a few 40k things in the past, and there are multiple versions. To the point that if you take something like, say, Dan Abnett's novels, right at the very beginning, they took quite a different direction for 40k to what had been presented from the studio at that point. But they were enormously popular, so they had an influence on 40k and started shifting things in a variety of different ways. And that is often the case with the various new creatives as they pop in on whatever IP you're working on. And from the roleplay perspective, we're always adding more depth. GMs can never get enough depth. They always want more. They're craving for it because they want to be inspired to tell a new tale with something that they haven't considered before. And providing that detail, particularly for a setting that's already calcified or wrapped up and frozen in ice, because everyone expects it to be one way, is extremely challenging. But it is something that is wanted and something that, we do. But we're fortunate because we're on the outside, so we can look at things like that and just write to not generics. We can write to specifics that you can then be inspired by. But those specifics could be a different take, a different angle. And we don't need to worry about contradicting the various other IPs out there, because we can just say, hey, our elves are like this today, and be inspired by that. That's awesome. How fucking cool is that? And that might never be in any particular setting, but it might then become part of your, I don't know, Call of Cthulhu, or it might become part of your D&D, or it might become part of your Forbidden Lands or whatever.
Yeah, and another thing we can do, because we are system agnostic and we're not bound to any system or even genre to some extent, is that we can, without going too far down the essay route, we can put in little boxes here and there saying, now, this is how this is it as written, but here's a couple of other different ways of looking at it, which, one of those might work better in your game, and have at it if they do.
Yeah, particularly when it comes to deep darkness and horror, it comes to levity, it comes to extremes. Some people are uncomfortable with extremes, and sometimes the extremes are not considered as extremes. Humor, and too much humor and too much lightheartedness, going down a more Terry Pratchett route, for example, than going down, say, a Dark Souls computer game route. Some people just do not want that anywhere near their games, particularly if it starts verging towards something like Monty Python. But including humor is an important part of ensuring that the darkness has contrast. So presenting different ways to spin things is important. Equally, some people don't want to have at their tables ever any sort of abuse, particularly child abuse or any other horrible situation. They just don't want that. So we can include that material as options. We can discuss around it while simultaneously not being saddled by it. Because darkness is a very real thing. And I think going away from it is often to the detriment of not just us and the maturity of games or any of that nonsense. It's something we all need to confront in our lives anyway. These things exist, and some people like to discuss them in the role-playing games. Other people just want a high fantasy where they can chop someone's head off. So it's important that we can do both while simultaneously allowing the GMs to have the power to do what they want with their games too.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question here. Wifrit was very much the child of the British political times then. How do you think modern politics and issues affect your modern design sensibilities?
Same way.
I would say so, yeah. I still can't resist throwing in a pop culture reference or a contemporary gag here and there. I don't think, even with Rookery, I don't think politics informed themes and approaches so much as it just was a breeding ground for little jokes to throw in.
I do wonder, though, I would say that as a person and maybe as a writer, that now I would think more about a viewpoint beyond my own than maybe you would have done when you wrote Wifrit.
Yes, that's true, and that sort of broadens out from political times to sort of social progress.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah.
So considered, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I would think more about, like, do no evil, but more than that, like try to actively, not necessarily do something good, but actually consider the broader impact of your work. That sounds really grandiose, and I don't mean it to. I just mean that I think sometimes in the early days of RPGs, people were writing for them and their friends and their gaming group, and if it went beyond that,
well, themselves, that's what we were with Woothrup as well. We were all a bunch of university-educated middle-class lads, and we wrote what we knew, and we wrote for people like us.
Yeah. Whereas now I think as a much more mature industry, you're writing for a much wider audience. And actually you need to consider some of the things that you would have said, oh, that's funny and that's okay, just wouldn't really be funny and wouldn't be okay now.
No, there are some references in, all the games from that period, but I'll call out the City-State of the Invincible Overlord in particular, in that they actually had an encounter table for encounters with women.
Wow. Okay.
And that was pretty much what you would expect from a group of, stereotypical male teenage, not terribly socially skilled people of the day. And Andy's gone mute again.
Andy, we can't hear you. Darker Days Radio does say, though, I think you can see this when you compare classic White Wolf Vampire and modern V20, V5. In the 90s, having a gay character was progressive. But now how you write them has to be more nuanced. Yeah, absolutely.
And I will, just to go back to like the original question and just to touch sort of more specifically on politics, I guess one thing that I'm certainly like aware of, obviously, there's been a lot of stuff about kind of like populism and kind of right-wing populist figures, and that's certainly something that I'm reflecting in the background. It's not necessarily the foreground of what we're doing, but it's definitely something that we're interested in. So I suppose it's the shape of what you are satirizing and critiquing shifts slightly, but the ethos of satirizing and critiquing those that are wrong ones remains. So
yeah, and I think the key word there is background. It can't help but inform some of what we do just because we're living in the world with this stuff going on, but we might not deliberately set out to make political points.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yay! you're back.
Yay! Okay, yeah. So I have a little one in this one. My own personal work is deeply influenced, but is not necessarily driven by this.
There you go.
I think that would be the correct angle. I think on a slightly different angle, and to repeat what Lindsay's saying, I think it's not just that what's the do they affect the modern design sense? It's not just that they do; it's they have to. We've moved on. We're no longer the people that we were 20 years ago. And there are certain things that nowadays we just don't. Oh, yes, that. And there's certain things that we just don't say and do these days. And if we do, we're doing it for a reason. We're not doing it as an offhand comment. We're often doing it to discuss these matters, not to diminish or to attack or to be titillated or to turn it into a game or anything similar. It's a different environment for all of us, and we have to tackle that in a mature way. So does it affect? Yes. And does politics affect? Definitely. How can it not? Our entire lives are based on this. Everything that we do is affected by it, so it's going to come into our work. And when you're in a fantasy world where you've got not just these people who are evil, for want of a better description, but they have very real reflections as to where that's going to lead. Sometimes your evil characters are going to look like almost political analogs, almost by the very fact that that's what people are like. That's how humanity is. That's how these things manifest. And in a horrific world where you've got demons and awfulness and all manner of terror and roots to power that the callous will take regardless, they're going to take those things, and seeing the natural evolution of those choices is part of the fun of building and designing these worlds, because you get people that you're not necessarily looking at and judging. You're just saying, where does this lead? What do people like this end up as? How do they manifest? So yes, works nicely.
And I think Lindsay summed it up in raising the point that we're now far more aware of how our work resonates and affects the people who read it and the people involved in the games. Back when I was writing Wolfroot First Edition, a trigger was something that was attached to a crossbow. And there's a lot more to think about these days, and rightly so.
Yeah, quite. And it's not, as almost controversial as this might be to say, it's not hard.
No, it really not.
You just need to do your due diligence.
It's not hard, but it does take work, and you need to do that work.
You just need to do the work, and it doesn't change necessarily the content that you're creating. What it does, if anything, is it makes it richer and deeper.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would also say you also need to be prepared to accept answers that you don't necessarily feel are right, but someone else tells you, and you like. I think you know what I mean by that, Andy. You and I have had those conversations where you've said, "But I don't see why X is a problem," and obviously my viewpoint is very narrow, so I'm only talking from my viewpoint. And I said, trust me, it is. And you said, well, I trust you. And so, it's good for us all to listen to
sum that one up. That would be, I've presented a situation, Lindsay's read it and said, you can't do that, to which I've replied, really? Okay, tell me what to do instead. And I've just taken what she said and I've rewritten around that, and it's often never changed anything. It's just all about phrasing and all about how things are presented.
There you have it. Yeah, Darker Days Radio just summed it up perfectly there.
Yeah, lived experience, much more eloquently than I did. We have to believe others experience the world from a different angle. Yeah, absolutely.
Agreed completely.
Yeah.
Oh. And that's our final comment for today, which...
Are we already done? Well, there you go.
We're already done.
Time flew. Yeah,
it certainly did. Thanks everyone. Pardon me for cutting out halfway through.
No, I'm sorry that I had to go and kick out a cat.
It's been one of those streams, isn't it?
Well, this is how you know it's live, folks.
Yeah.
It just happens.
Well, thank you, everyone, and we will hopefully see you all at our next stream, which will either be next Saturday or watch out potentially for one this week. But I'm not.
Did anyone make any replies to that?
No, I don't think so.
Drop it in the comments now. There's a few people still online. Drop in a day when you can turn up. As long as I have 2 or 3 there, that'll do. Because we can drop it on YouTube later, so it'll be fine.
Right.
Thanks, everyone.
Right,
Bye.
bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
From